Late at night in Hawthorne Cross, a sprawling city in the heart of Brixton, a single pair of flashing red and blue lights would soon spark a raging scandal. The driver, Kevin Monroe, had no idea he was about to collide head-on with a corrupt system. All he wanted was to get home after an evening out. But what started as a routine traffic stop turned into a desperate fight for truth, one that would draw in judges, prosecutors, police brass, and even the watchful eyes of an entire nation. Have you ever thought about what happens when the wrong person gets targeted, someone with both the knowledge and the power to strike back? This is that story, a seemingly ordinary arrest that blew the lid off a system many claimed was untouchable. And it all began with a single lie: your taillight is out. Hawthorne Cross might look like any other city after midnight. Streetlights flicker on deserted avenues, and neon signs light up corner diners. On that humid night, Kevin Monroe eased his car onto Bleecker Avenue, thinking only about a soft bed and an early morning. He was a dedicated professional, detail-oriented, even cautious by nature. The hum of his car's engine was the only sound breaking the quiet. Just a few blocks from his apartment, the rearview mirror caught a glimmer of red and blue. Kevin sighed. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't rolled through a stop sign. Instinctively, he flicked on his turn signal, pulled over, and tried to steady his breathing. The tension in the pit of his stomach wasn't unfamiliar. Too many stories circulated among drivers who got pulled over for no reason other than meeting a hidden quota or matching a vague description. Still, he gathered his documents, hoping this would be nothing more than a brief delay. Moments later, two silhouettes emerged from the patrol car, the harsh glare of their headlights obscuring Kevin's vision. He squinted, feeling a jolt of anxiety. There was an intensity in the officer's posture that put him on high alert. One tapped the window. Kevin lowered it, silently praying this would all be over quickly. Officer Joel Moran was the first to speak. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a no-nonsense haircut, he barked, "License and registration." His tone carried an edge that immediately unsettled Kevin. The second officer, James Ortega, hovered just behind the passenger window, arms folded across his chest. "Sure," Kevin replied, handing over the documents. "Could I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Moran's expression hardened. "Broken taillight," he said tersely. Kevin's brow furrowed. He'd recently replaced his brake lights. He'd even noticed their reflection moments before the officers stopped him. Clearly, something wasn't right. "I'm pretty sure they're working fine," he said, measured yet perplexed. "Step out of the vehicle," Moran cut in, ignoring the question. A slight ripple of tension passed between Moran and Ortega. Kevin stayed in his seat, recalling his rights. He knew that officers needed a valid reason to demand that someone exit a car. But his hesitation was all it took for Ortega to move in. "Now," Ortega snapped, yanking the door open. Before Kevin could process what was happening, Moran reached in and clamped a firm grip on Kevin's arm. Pain shot up his shoulder as they forced him out. The seatbelt locked across his torso, nearly knocking the wind out of him. "What the—" Kevin began, but Moran silenced him with a brutal twist of his wrist. Cold metal closed around his left wrist, and in a blink, his right arm was pinned behind him. "You're resisting," Ortega declared, face devoid of emotion. Kevin's heart pounded. This was a setup, he was sure of it. But as he felt the steel cuffs tighten, he realized something else: these officers had no idea who he actually was. They saw another driver to bully, another arrest to pad their record. And they believed the system would back them up, the way it always did. Days later, the bustling corridors of the Hawthorne Cross Municipal Courthouse became Kevin's reluctant stage. He wasn't in his usual seat as an observing legal mind or a consultant. Instead, he sat at the defense table, the neon lights overhead giving the marble floor a sterile sheen. Charged with resisting arrest, obstruction, and disorderly conduct, Kevin found himself on the wrong side of a system he had once trusted. At the front of the courtroom was Judge Caroline Hughes, known throughout Hawthorne Cross for her strict sentencing and low tolerance for what she called nonsense. She was in her mid-60s, with a steely gray bun and a sharp gaze that could intimidate the most hardened public defenders. Kevin's own attorney, David Lynn, was a public defender carrying a mountain of case files. He whispered anxiously to Kevin before the session began, "She's tough. We'll have to be methodical." Across the aisle stood Prosecutor Michael Grady, a man with an easy smirk and a meticulously pressed suit. He waved courteously to Officers Moran and Ortega, who sat primly, their expressions smug. Kevin felt a surge of frustration, but he willed himself to remain calm. "This is a straightforward matter," Grady began once court was in session. The defendant escalated a routine traffic stop by refusing officers' lawful commands. He made sure to project confidence, gesturing to Moran and Ortega as if they were pillars of virtue. David Lynn rose to object. "Your Honor, we question the validity of the stop in the first place. There's no evidence Mr. Monroe's taillight was broken or that he was aggressive." Judge Hughes cast a disinterested glance. "Objection noted. Proceed." It was clear, from that single dismissive wave, whose side she was leaning toward. The officers recounted their fabricated tale. "He was belligerent," Moran insisted. "We feared for our safety," Ortega added. Each lie was as well rehearsed as a script. Kevin clenched his jaw, every muscle in his body tensing. He had spent years upholding the law, believing in its ability to protect citizens. Now he found himself grappling with the grim reality of how easily truth could be twisted. Then came David Lynn's moment to call Kevin to the stand. Nobody else in that courtroom realized this was about to become something far bigger than a mere traffic stop. Kevin walked up, placed a hand on the Bible, and prepared to deliver testimony that would rattle everyone to the core. On the witness stand, Kevin looked out over the rows of silent onlookers. The hum of the air conditioning droned in the background. Grady started his cross-examination. "Mr. Monroe, you acknowledge you did not exit the vehicle when asked, correct?" Kevin inhaled slowly. "I asked for the reason. That is well within my rights." Grady smirked, turning to the jury as though Kevin's intelligence were an inconvenience. "But officers gave you a direct order. Failing to comply was not warranted," Kevin cut in calmly. "Because my taillight wasn't actually broken, and there was no probable cause." Judge Hughes narrowed her eyes. "Watch your tone, Mr. Monroe." That's when Kevin felt the moment crystallize. He placed his briefcase on his lap, clicked it open, and retrieved something that looked like a small badge. David Lynn's eyes widened in confusion. Up until now, he'd never seen it, and they'd never discussed it. "Before we go further," Kevin said, voice resonating through the hush, "I think it's important to mention who I really am." He held up the badge for everyone to see. "Kevin Monroe, federal prosecutor for the Eastern Circuit of Brixton." A stunned silence settled over the room. The color drained from Prosecutor Grady's face, and Judge Hughes visibly stiffened. The two officers exchanged panicked looks. On the jury's bench, a few gasps escaped. Grady cleared his throat, rifling through his papers as though a crucial detail had been misplaced. Judge Hughes's gavel hovered indecisively. You're a federal prosecutor," Grady managed to say, voice wavering. Kevin set the badge on the ledge of the witness stand. "That's correct. And everything that took place during this traffic stop was illegal." At that moment, the entire dynamic shifted. Judge Hughes seemed to realize that any overt bias would now be heavily scrutinized, not just by local reporters but potentially by the federal government. The two officers, once so confident, sat rigidly, jaws clenched, eyes flicking anxiously between Kevin and Grady. In a heartbeat, the case mutated from a routine local matter into a looming scandal that could topple careers and tarnish reputations. News travels fast in the modern world. By the end of that same day, a young reporter from the Hawthorne Cross Observer had typed out an incendiary article, "Federal Prosecutor Wrongfully Arrested in Alleged Police Setup." That headline was enough to ignite social media. Within hours, Kevin's story spread across platforms, hashtags, reshares, memes capturing the exact moment he flashed his credentials in court. Every feed was abuzz with a single question: if these officers had no qualms about fabricating charges against a federal prosecutor, how many others had they railroaded? Local television stations ran round-the-clock segments. Talk show hosts invited legal analysts to dissect the case. Phone footage from people inside the courtroom, though technically not allowed, began to surface, showing the collective gasp that rippled through the bench when Kevin revealed his true identity. In living rooms across Brixton, families watched open-mouthed. Could it be that the very institutions meant to protect citizens were systematically abusing their power? The public outcry in Hawthorne Cross grew. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse steps, some holding placards demanding justice for Kevin Monroe, others calling for wide-scale police reforms. David Lynn, though he was only Kevin's public defender, found himself swept into press conferences and panel interviews, recounting the bizarre day in court. He told journalists that he believed they were only scratching the surface of a deeper issue. Then came the real bombshell, an anonymous leak. A massive trove of internal emails from the Hawthorne Cross Police Department landed on the desk of local civil rights attorney Marisol Green, who immediately recognized their significance. The emails suggested a pattern of fabricating reasons for traffic stops, particularly when pulling over drivers in certain neighborhoods. They hinted at unwritten quotas, racial profiling, and coded language about maximizing arrests. In a heartbeat, the scandal was no longer confined to Kevin Monroe's single incident. It was system-wide. The demands for accountability turned into a roar as activists, faith leaders, and outraged citizens crowded the sidewalks outside precincts and City Hall. For those few days, Hawthorne Cross looked more like a flashpoint for national attention than a sleepy Brixton city. And Kevin, the once unknown driver, was caught in the eye of the storm. But as he watched the uproar from his small apartment window, he knew this was only the beginning. Weeks passed, each bringing fresh revelations. Judge Caroline Hughes, cornered by the relentless media coverage, tried to move the case along. She likely hoped to deal with it quietly, but with the entire region watching, every step was amplified. When Kevin Monroe returned to court for closing arguments, the packed gallery whispered anxiously. David Lynn looked more determined than ever, armed with new evidence gleaned from those leaked internal emails. Prosecutor Michael Grady had lost that haughty veneer, his shoulders slumped, and a nervous tick under his left eye betrayed mounting pressure. Judge Hughes cleared her throat, scanning a file thick with last-minute motions and statements. The tension was palpable as she prepared to read the verdict. In the front row, supporters of Kevin, along with curious citizens, collectively held their breath. At last, the verdict rang out, not guilty. A wave of relief rippled through Kevin's body, yet he stood motionless, hands at his sides. The real moment came when Judge Hughes followed up with the announcement that all evidence relating to the officer's conduct would be forwarded to Brixton's Attorney General for a separate investigation. A murmur of shock and approval roiled through the gallery. The officers, Moran and Ortega, stared in disbelief, their once confident faces etched with fear for what lay ahead. Outside the courthouse, crowds surged. Cheers, camera flashes, and spontaneous chanting filled the air. Kevin, stepping out beneath the bright midday sun, felt a wave of conflicting emotions. It wasn't victory he felt. It was the heavy weight of a question: how many more innocent people had gone through a nightmare like this and never gotten the chance to fight back? If anyone thought the story ended with Kevin Monroe walking free, they were mistaken. The media firestorm only intensified in the days following the verdict. Anonymous tips poured into local newsrooms, unveiling more cases of questionable stops, missing body cam footage, and suspiciously similar police reports. The Hawthorne Cross Police Department attempted a weak internal investigation, claiming they took the matter seriously. But the public had grown wary of self-policing measures. Under mounting pressure, the mayor announced a special commission to oversee the entire department's practices. Suddenly, every headline in Hawthorne Cross was about corruption, racial profiling, or official misconduct. Meanwhile, Kevin started receiving calls and emails from people with stories like his, average citizens who'd been targeted by the same officers. Some told harrowing tales of nights in jail because they dared to question a bogus traffic stop. Others described losing jobs or even custody battles after getting entangled in the legal system. The scope of the scandal ballooned beyond Kevin's imagination. Civil rights groups, emboldened by his willingness to speak out, began filing class action lawsuits. Lawyers from all over Brixton converged on Hawthorne Cross, sniffing out the chance to dismantle a corrupt apparatus that had been hidden in plain sight for years. At the center of it all stood Kevin Monroe, the reluctant face of the movement. News anchors invited him to primetime slots, calling him a hero. But he wasn't comfortable with that title. He kept reminding anyone who asked that he'd been lucky to have resources and legal knowledge. "I'm not the real story," he would say. "The people who suffered quietly for years, they're the story." It was a sweltering afternoon when Kevin walked out of a local radio station interview. Protesters were gathered nearby, chanting for justice, demanding the resignation of top brass at the Hawthorne Cross Police Department. A reporter spotted him and pushed a microphone forward. "Mr. Monroe," she said, "what do you say to those who feel this verdict finally brought justice?" Kevin pressed his lips together thoughtfully. "Justice isn't a one-time event," he replied. "We got a glimpse of accountability, but that doesn't fix the system overnight." He recalled the first moment those handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He remembered the sneer on Moran's face, the practiced lies in Ortega's statement, and the judge's dismissive attitude, until the truth came out. All those pieces highlighted a bigger reality, the kind of corruption that thrives in darkness but wilts under scrutiny. And it took one chance encounter, with the wrong man, or rather the right man, to bring it into the light. "So what's next?" the reporter pressed. "Next," Kevin answered, "is a deeper fight. If this can happen to me, a federal prosecutor, it can happen to anyone. The real task is ensuring it stops happening altogether." From that day forward, Kevin continued using his platform to shine a spotlight on the hidden corners of the system. He worked with civil rights attorneys to unearth old cases, many of which got reopened. Former defendants, people who'd accepted guilty pleas to avoid harsher charges, spoke out, some seeking exonerations and restitution for the damage done. Behind each injustice was a story of human suffering, and Kevin made it his mission to humanize them all. He understood that true reform goes beyond merely punishing two bad officers. It meant re-examining every link in the chain: judges, prosecutors, city officials, and law enforcement administrators who had, by action or neglect, allowed this culture to flourish. That's how the legend of Kevin Monroe's traffic stop became a turning point. It was a catalyst for a wave of reform. People no longer hesitated to pull out their phones and record questionable police interactions. Local politicians ran on platforms promising transparent investigations and meaningful checks on power. Within a year, Hawthorne Cross's entire police oversight board was revamped, with new guidelines for officer accountability and public transparency of records. But you might be asking yourself, why does any of this matter to me? Because Kevin Monroe's story is universal. It's a reminder that injustice can hide in plain sight. Sometimes it takes a single spark, a courageous individual with the right credentials or the right platform, to pull back the curtain. Now, the question for each of us is whether we'll keep that curtain open or allow it to fall shut again. We often assume that once the news cycle moves on, the problem is solved. However, the real battle is making sure corrupt practices stay in the spotlight until they are truly dismantled. The story here isn't that Kevin won his case. The story is that thousands more still face battles with no camera in the courtroom, no star attorney on their side, and no viral headlines to rally support. That's the fight worth fighting. So if you've watched this whole video and felt even a twinge of outrage or empathy, hold on to that spark. Speak up. Ask questions. Share stories like Kevin's, because every beam of attention forces accountability. The more we talk about these issues, the harder it becomes to sweep them under the rug. In the end, one single traffic stop transformed Hawthorne Cross from a quiet Brixton city into a battleground for civil rights and police reform. But the real transformation is just beginning, and it's not confined to a courtroom or a headline. It's out there, in every conversation that refuses to let corruption and injustice simmer quietly beneath the surface. If this story made you question the nature of justice or wonder about those unheard voices, don't let it end here. Share this video with friends, colleagues, and family who need a reminder that change is possible, even if it starts with one person. Stay informed about local politics and law enforcement policies. Raise your voice when you see wrongdoing. Because when enough people refuse to look away, that's when a broken system has no choice but to face the light. And that, right there, is how real, lasting change begins.